Кто бы ни пытался помешать нам, а тем более создать угрозы для нашей страны, для нашего народа, должны знать, что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались.
Hello and welcome to the 7th and the final episode of the second series of Chicago Dialogues. I'm Dipesh Chakrabarty. I teach history and South Asian studies at the University of Chicago and currently serve as the faculty director of the university's center in Delhi. This series, as you will know, has been produced in collaboration with Prohor.in and has been anchored by Avik Chanda, who is a multi-talented friend of the center and is also himself a best-selling author. I'm also very grateful to my colleagues at the Delhi Center, without whose help and advice this series would have been impossible to run. And we've had many interesting conversations on this series. And today, we're very privileged to have two distinguished colleagues from our political science department, Paul Staniland and Rochelle Terman, discussing global security, or really the insecurities of geopolitics in the 21st century. Avik Chanda will anchor this program as well. And on the eve of starting this final episode, I wish all our viewers and everybody on this panel a good future amidst all the insecurities that humanity seems to be facing. So over to you, Avik.
Thanks for that, Dipesh, and very warm welcome to all our viewers joining us live across the world. As Dipesh mentioned, this is the seventh and the concluding episode, the final episode of the second series of Chicago Dialogues. And before we get started, it might be worthwhile to sort of, cast a quick glance over these two seasons and back to the time where it all began in 2020, when, all around us, really, the world was deep in the COVID pandemic crisis. And the feedback that we've received from our viewers since then is that the wide-ranging discussions that have formed the Chicago Dialogue series have provided company, have provided much food for thought, and at many times also solace to tens of thousands of viewers. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you all very much, viewers, for being part of us and part of this journey together with us. I'd also like to take this moment to especially thank Dipesh Chakrabarty, Dipesh Da, for being such a wonderful mentor to this entire initiative, this program, and also to his colleagues, Lenny Chaudhary, Suman Singh, Arvind Balan, and everybody else at the UChicago Center in Delhi. And also a huge round of thanks to Anitesh Chakrabarty, Akash, Tanmay, Shonak, and everybody else at Proho.in, so our media partner, and they've been doing a stellar job broadcasting and promoting this series. So now on to the event, today's session, the new geopolitics of the 21st century. What I'll do is I'll very quickly, briefly introduce our panelists and then get started with the questions. As with all the other sessions, we would dedicate time at the back of this session, of this event, to take questions from the live audience. So first up, we have with us Paul Staniland, who is the Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. And he's also a non-resident scholar in the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's the faculty chair of the Committee on International Relations MA program. His research essentially focuses on political violence and international security, with a regional focus on South and Southeast Asia. His first book, Networks of Rebellion, Explaining Insurgent Cohesion and Collapse, was published by Cornell University Press in 2014, and his second book, Ordering Violence, Explaining Armed Group State Relations from Conflict to Cooperation, was also published by Cornell University Press in 2021, last year, and he received the 2022 Karl Deutsch Award from the International Studies Association. And joining him today would be his colleague, Rochelle Terman, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. She studies international norms, gender, and advocacy with a focus on the Muslim world. Her current book project, which is called Backlash, Defiance, Human Rights, and the Politics of Shame, essentially investigates counterproductive consequences of global naming and shaming campaigns. Now, this particular work is based on her dissertation, which won the 2017 Mercer Tate Award for the best dissertation in international relations, law, and politics from the American Political Science Association. So, Paul, Rochelle, a very warm welcome and very good morning to you both.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Thank you. It's
Paul,
my pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. So, Paul, let me get started with you. I think today, correct me if I'm wrong, getting the dates wrong, is probably the 133rd or the 134th day of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And this continuing war seems to have upended a number of assumptions or perceived wisdom about the nature of world politics. So in your view, what do you think has really changed and what hasn't?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think it depends kind of who you're talking to when we talk about what expectations were. But I think at least among many people in the United States, Western Europe, maybe Japan, if you cast your eyes back to the 1990s, there was a whole spate of work about kind of the nature of the post-Cold War world. People like Thomas Friedman. I don't know if anybody's read his book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, but it sold, probably literally millions of copies in 1998 or 1999 or so. And the argument there was that we were in a new age of globalization economically and security cooperation among kind of substantial powers under the aegis of largely an American-led, but kind of transatlantic global order that could generate this kind of harmonious, reinforcing circle of economic interdependence, democracy, and great power peace, right? Now, from that perspective, I think not just the Ukraine war, but also kind of the last 5 or 10 years of maybe really the last 20 years of international politics have unsettled a lot of those assumptions. And that's not to say that there's nothing to them. It's not to say that economic interdependence doesn't matter or that international institutions are irrelevant, but I think it does suggest limits to at least some of the more far-reaching assumptions that were made. And let me talk about just a couple of those. The first is about the nature of warfare in the 21st century. I think after the end of the Cold War, there was a understandable, and I was part of it, focus on civil wars, insurgencies, irregular warfare, thinking about Iraq, Afghanistan in particular, but also a whole kind of spate of internal conflicts. Think of Bosnia, for instance, or in South Asia, the Sri Lankan conflict, right? And that was the future of warfare. Counterinsurgency, insurgency, hybrid conflict. What we're seeing in Ukraine, especially these days in Eastern Ukraine, is conventional major power conflict. In the case of Russia, major power. In the case of Ukraine, increasingly being supplied by other major powers. This is trench warfare, massive artillery. It's not Iraq 2009. It's not Afghanistan 2001. It's much more like in some, very sad and tragic ways, like trench warfare in World War I. now, especially in eastern Ukraine. So I think the nature of warfare has not looked the way it was supposed to look, right? And I think we can think about, US and China, that would be a very different kind of war, but it would be a major power conventional war, missiles, airplanes, aircraft carriers, that kind of thing, not light or heavy footprint counterinsurgency and guerrilla warfare. I think also the way in which globalization does and doesn't matter. I think we can think in more sophisticated ways now. And it's not my area of focus, but I think in the old days, as it were, and I'm now increasingly old. So when I think about the old days, it's like when I was a teenager. There was this idea that globalization, again, there was this idea of a virtuous circle, right? And you would get kind of growing convergence in countries' domestic economic systems under a kind of globalized, shared international economic order. And what we're seeing today is different. There's a phrase that political scientists came up with a few years ago called weaponized interdependence, in which globalization does fundamentally change many aspects of international economics, but it also creates leverage points, areas of contest over influence. So we see it in both directions in the Ukraine conflict. On the one hand, the West has been able to really restrict Russian access to a lot of international capital, all kinds of sanctions that are kind of probing into these kind of fundamental parts of flows of goods and capital and people as well in the international system. In response, the Russians and the Chinese are kind of mobilizing their own assets, for instance, Russian control over natural resource exports, or the Chinese ability to kind of use capital and lending overseas in a whole variety of political ways, right? And so what we're seeing is not the end of globalization per se, right? But the kind of battles over constituent parts of globalization, different flows of people, money, goods, and the ways those can be contested by great power. So rather than a single kind of harmonious globalized order, we're continuing to see globalization, but it takes on a much more kind of conflictual form that may end up looking like contending blocks, but at least right now when it comes to China is much more uneven, right? Some areas of intense competition, others, looking at exports of manufacturing out of China, for instance, continuing to look like they did before. So those are a few ways in which I think we're seeing kind of a much more complicated world than at least kind of the pundit version was 20 or 30 years ago. And so at least that's, I think, a useful starting point for this conversation.
Yes, absolutely. Rochelle, over to you. I mean, Paul mentioned in passing the ecosystem and the sort of, dynamics of economics from a domestic standpoint. Now, if you turn the lens inwards and you're looking at American domestic politics at home, to what extent and in what shape or form does that really have an impact on the US foreign policy abroad?
Thank you, Avik. It's a great question, and it's hard to answer, of course, because American politics is so tumultuous right now. As you know, historically, at least, international relations scholars based in the United States have kind of tended to think about foreign policy and international relations as kind of insulated from domestic politics. So whoever the president was, whatever party was in power, there was sort of a consensus in Washington about America's role in the world, what our basic interests are, what threaten those interests, and so on. And I think what we're seeing is the kind of demise of that consensus, and many scholars are starting to question that basic idea that foreign policy is insulated. The consensus that wants to find the dominant foreign policy narrative is starting to fragment, it's starting to polarize, along with every other policy domain in the United States, which is also fragmenting and polarizing. So what this means is that the institutions that we've come to rely on are drastically changing, leading to instability, to confusion. So while I can't predict what direction US foreign policy will go, that's kind of the main point, is that no one can predict which direction US foreign policy will go. And I do expect that chaos, that basic inability to predict, to play an important role in itself in international relations. So allies, adversaries alike can no longer predict which direction the US will go, whether it'll abide by previous promises, whether it'll intervene in certain conflicts, whether it will withdraw. And that kind of ontological insecurity, if you will, kind of the inability to know what'll happen, the inability to really be able to guess whether X will lead to Y, that'll have downstream effects. So it might lead nations to look elsewhere for security and economic partnerships, perhaps with a pivot towards China. It might also embolden countries to take riskier actions, which is what I think happened with Putin.
Right. And Rochelle, I mean, when you were talking, I was just thinking about the ways in which possibly in the lack of a predictive model, we could probably use factors, we could use data, because you've done a lot of work with data modeling, particularly when you're talking about, let's say, naming and shaming and the effects that would probably have, right, to an extent, to be able to predict. And I'm wondering if there are, broadly speaking, any set of factors or conditions which you could say, all right, if the following hold, A, B, and C, and not Z, then chances are the policy is going to evolve or turn in a particular direction?
I mean, I think that's kind of the holy grail that I think a lot of international relations scholars are trying to achieve. So, this is, some scholars might think like in very big terms like that. So my colleague John Mearsheimer, for example, might consider, okay, under certain assumptions, like that we have a nation state system, and that it's a self-help system, certain, A, B, and C are going to lead to kind of certain outcomes. But at least in my view, I think that the world is a little bit more complicated than that. There are certain advantages, of course, to simplifying our models in order to make kind of parsimonious predictions. But at least from my perspective, and having kind of perhaps grown up along with Paul, seeing the events unfold as they have, I think it's really, really difficult to identify those kind of key particular conditions. But hopefully, maybe one day I'll stumble upon it.
Yeah, great. Paul, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been a big challenge, and in some way, it's one that faces policymakers as well. And in some ways, it was Joe Biden's theory of the case. His campaign was, let's get back to normal, right? And we'll be predictable. We'll have competent governance. We'll find a way to unite. We'll identify our interests. We'll be credible abroad. We'll be a good example of democracy. We will kind of lead the way, right? And we will be an example of democracy versus autocracy, framed it that way, which was a little bit worrisome, right? Because if you say what happens in America over the next 4 years is the test of whether democracy is a better idea than autocracy, you better hope the next 4 years go well, right? And I think it's fair to say they haven't gone great thus far. And some of that's Joe Biden's fault. A lot of it's, out of his control. But I think what he and his administration have run into is that there are limits to what they can do to restore something like normalcy. Now, whether that normalcy existed before at all, I think is a different question, but they believed it did. And their idea is we're going to get back to that. And so, the political scientists could then show up and say, well, we have a relatively unified government. We have, somebody who does not have wild personality fluctuations like Trump. And so we can predict that the US is likely to do this, but not that, right? That's just not the world we're in right now. We have a deeply polarized country politically. Economically, we have kind of these new patterns of inequality that make it very difficult to do things like pursue free trade agreements the way we used to be able to do. Or at the same time, figure out what a redistribution arrangement would look like. Because it's not just like there are people who want more money from the government and people who want less. Those are now cross-cut with these deep cultural and geographic divisions that kind of make it all just kind of swirling chaos as we look toward the 2022 midterms and the 2024 elections. And in some ways, I think this is compatible with how political scientists think about what international in a world of domestic instability and division. Third Republic France is an example of this. Where it's like, yeah, there's the Germans out there and that's a problem, but we have all kinds of problems internally as well. And we can't figure out what the right answers even are for our international problems because we disagree ourselves about like what are the constituent parts that our political system kind of should be made of and how it should function.
Right. So Paul, in your earlier answer, you touched upon not just the US and Russia, but also Europe. You talked about China and the role that it's playing. And purely out of personal curiosity, for me being an Indian, and many of our viewers are really of Indian provenance, and they follow the geopolitics of the subcontinent very closely. And I think the question which is there in everybody's mind is, if you take this entire, what do you call it, mesh or vector of geopolitical tensions all across this world. Where does India really fit into this larger picture?
That's a great question. And I think it's something that obviously Indian policymakers are wrestling with very hard right now, right? As they're dealing with increases and then maybe decreases in oil prices, as they're dealing with pressure from different sides, criticisms from some quarters, support from other quarters, all the rest of it. I think here's how I've come to think about it provisionally, and this could all change depending what happens. I think India, there are two things going on. One is India has a set of material constraints and opportunities, right? So there are dependencies, for instance, on Russia for certain kinds of military technology and supplies. There are also opportunities. If Russia is willing to sell oil at a lower cost, great. Going back to material challenges, India is faced with a not particularly friendly China right on its border, which is allied with an extremely unfriendly Pakistan on its other border, right? And so that creates this cross-cutting set of material incentives. On the one hand, there are reasons to look favorably upon, not favorably, but not to press Russia particularly hard, right? This is a war far away in Europe, right? As the external affairs minister said, Europe's problems are not necessarily the world's problems, right? On the other hand, the way this is shaping out is that China now is becoming more important as a supporter of Russia and as a leader of kind of a counter bloc against the United States and Europe and Japan. And that's a problem for India, right? Because China is potentially the dominant power in Asia. Obviously, we saw the border clashes of 2022, as well as border crises in 2017 and 2013, and the war in 1962, and clashes in 1967 and 1987-88, that India-China relations are quite tumultuous and potentially quite foreboding. And so I think India is in this interesting position of both opportunity as this pivot player that's able to be on decent terms with everybody, but also some potential risks that kind of what you'll end up with is a tightening up of the US-European alignment, plus Japan, maybe a couple other countries, right? And a tightening up of the Russia-China alignment. And so you could see a world of blocks, which is what India has always been very worried about, kind of being frozen out of a block system. And so there are these kind of, I think, these complicated dynamics at play. Right now, I think India, from its own perspective, has done a reasonable job of navigating those. I think it wasn't very surprising to me that India, as someone who studied Indian foreign policy, none of this has been all that shocking. I think this is how India has largely tried to proceed. Not actively supporting the Russian war effort, but also kind of being like, what do you expect us to do? Like, we don't have that much leverage over Russia. And we're not signing up to an Anglo-American, or sorry, an American-European kind of, intensification of major power war and conflict in Europe. And so I think, that makes sense. I think on the other hand, it's generated some real doubts or concerns among very prominent supporters of India in the United States, where I think some of these people should have known better, right? Or should have had kind of more realistic or proper expectations. But many people in Washington have really thought like India is on our side, right? We are part of an anti-China or at least China skeptical coalition of democracies against a rising autocratic power. And then the Ukraine war happens and the Indians are kind of like, look, there should be a ceasefire, peace talks, negotiations. Let's figure this out, but let's avoid blocks. And that doesn't look like what Washington's impetus has been. Or to a lesser, in other ways, London, and to a lesser extent, Paris and Berlin. And so I think it's opened eyes in ways good, bad, indifferent in the West about kind of how India positions itself. So those are material opportunities. I think there's also kind of, I don't want to call it ideological because that may seem pejorative, but a long-standing desire in Indian foreign policy to have autonomy, to not be subject to the diktats of other external powers, right? And this has many roots, historical, contemporary, economic, political, but basically not wanting to be kind of a junior partner of anybody. And so on the one hand, this provides great opportunities to pursue that long-standing goal of something like strategic autonomy while being on good terms with everybody, which was not how the Cold War ended up shaping out, right? But also this fear, again, of kind of being frozen out, which then generates dynamics of dependence and subordination that Indian policymakers are deeply averse to. So that's my kind of long-winded take on kind of how to think about this. Both from the Indian perspective and also kind of from the Western perspective, where some people have been very surprised by Indian behavior, though I don't think they should have been.
Right. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the West, particularly the US, was primarily on the side of India throughout the entire sort of cross-border conflicts that India had with China through most of last year. And I'm just wondering if you're worried that in its new bid to appear completely neutral in a sort of geopolitical standpoint, it's probably alienating, or it's rubbing people off the wrong way as far as Washington's concerned, at least, and it's not burning those bridges.
Yeah, I think it depends kind of who you're reading and what you're listening to. Like if you wander into the world of like IR South Asia Twitter, it's just kind of constant warfare, where it's like the Americans didn't support us against the Chinese, and then someone says, well, actually, they did, but the Indians didn't want us to say anything publicly about it because they were trying to kind of keep it relaxed. So kind of if you just ignore Twitter for a moment, which I think is generally good advice as someone who spends too much time on Twitter, I would say that overall, the Western response in terms of policymaking has not been especially sharp. I don't think burning bridges is the right, and I think that's much too extreme. I think what you see is kind of a tempering of expectations, which I think in both directions was probably a wise idea anyways, which is to say we're going to work together on China-related issues to the extent those can be untangled from others. And then there are going to be areas where we're just going to be disagreeing. And the Americans will put some pressure, maybe lightly, maybe less lightly on the Indians. The Indians are grown-ups. They can respond however they want. The Chinese will show up, kind of saying, hey, let's reset. Let's rethink everything, even as they're building up military infrastructure on their side of the disputed border area. So I don't think it's kind of a cataclysmic shift in direction. That's my sense. Other people may disagree, but I think, there's this problem that Washington has, or at least parts of Washington, where they kind of want to have it all. Right? And that's just not the way the world works. I think when push comes to shove, the primary focus of a lot of people in Washington will ultimately be China. And there, India becomes a useful partner, maybe not an ally per se, but a partner. And so I don't expect there to be really severe consequences of India's current position. That said, as I said in my previous comment, there's some downside risks as well. Even if nobody wants to put India in a tough place, if you end up in this kind of block world, China, Russia here, the US, India here, then it's like, whether anybody wants to put India in a hard position or not is a different question. May just structurally end up being, rather than friends with everybody, kind of not being as close of friends with, either side as its own internal bloc is.
Right. Rochelle, I'm wondering if we can shift the lens or shift gears to talking about human rights, which is coming to deep focus. Whether you're talking about civilians being targeted and malls being bombed as part of the Russia's aggressive campaign in the Ukraine, or the absolute trampling of human rights post Taliban's taking over second time round in Afghanistan. And I'm wondering, in your view, what are some of these sort of best practices, if you will, or proven means of advancing the entire human rights discourse in the political arena? And within the context of this, something that you work on deeply, naming and shaming. To what extent does naming and shaming create an impact and help to arrive at the desired outcomes?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm going to kind of take the second part of that question first, and then circle back around. Let me just kind of take a second here to explain what we mean by shaming, like what IR scholars mean when they talk about shaming. We're talking about the international community, and by that I mean states, but also non-state actors like human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. We're also talking about international organizations like the United Nations. We're talking about other experts kind of coming together to exert moral pressure on countries that violate human rights. And for many years, the consensus has, among many circles in international relations, has been that shaming is really one of the best tools that we have to combat human rights violations. Human rights are a really tricky business because we make these international human rights treaties, but the beneficiaries of those treaties are citizens in other countries, right? Which are going to make it kind of unique from other kinds of multilateral treaty regimes. So we're limited in the kinds of things that we can do to protect human rights elsewhere. But the proposal is that shaming, kind of calling out violators, putting them in the international spotlight, works by isolating the regime from the international community, embarrassing its leaders, which then incentivizes governments to comply with human rights norms in order to maintain legitimacy both from outward on the international stage, but also legitimacy domestically, because shaming could potentially mobilize domestic opposition in the target state, which puts kind of pressure on policymakers from below. So in contrast, my work shows that shaming can be counterproductive. And that's because it often sparks a nationalist reaction in the target state. The basic intuition is really simple. People typically resent being told what to do, especially by foreign actors, and they respond defensively, kind of regardless, even if they support human rights. If they are kind of being told what to do, they might respond defensively. So in light of that reaction, leaders could be rewarded for standing up to international pressure and defending the nation against this perceived domination. Meanwhile, leaders who give in to international pressure might have their political legitimacy undermined at home. And so the result is that violations tend to persist or even exacerbate. So then what does help? Well, one of the key insights that has come out of my work, and I think others as well, is that when it comes to international human rights enforcement or shaming, the critic matters just as much or probably even more than the criticism. If you shame a geopolitical adversary, for example, it's a very common thing, but it rarely works and it's likely to backfire because it's really easy to cast that criticism as being driven by hostile motivations to tar our reputation and so on. Shaming a geopolitical ally is more credible and it's more effective, but it's also a lot more difficult to mobilize because we want to protect our friends, right? We want to maintain good relationships with our friends, and people typically resent being kind of called a human rights violator. So that's kind of the puzzle or the paradox, if you will. And in my view, the best way to advance human rights is through explicitly political means, and it's difficult. So to take the United States, for example, the United States, if we really want to promote human rights abroad, we have to find the political will to enforce human rights, even among our strategic friends and allies, like Saudi Arabia, for example. So if we really want to actually make an impact, we can't continue to enable abusive regimes by providing arms, by providing intelligence, by providing political cover. We kind of need to not be hypocrites in that sense. Of course, then we again go back to this knot in which as soon as we do that, we're going to have to risk the benefits that come with our strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia. But then it really comes a matter of our priorities and what we're willing to do to actually promote human rights abroad.
Right. So Rochelle, in between the two sort of ends of the spectrum, one you're talking about political adversaries, where they're shaming a particular power or government is more likely than not to be counterproductive, and on the other hand, you've got allies, right? And I'm wondering where in this range in the spectrum would the impact of shaming or impact of reports and findings and surveys by bodies such as Amnesty International feature? Would it be somewhere in between?
Oh, do you mean, just to clarify, do you mean shaming by those NGOs? Like, what kind of role do they play?
Yes.
Yeah, yes. It's a great question. So in my view, I think it's helpful to make a distinction between transnational NGOs like your Amnesty Internationals and your Human Rights Watch, and your local NGOs. And what unfortunately sometimes happens is that when there's kind of an onslaught of international shaming, especially from foreign adversaries, the folks who really suffer are the local advocates on the ground, even if they kind of have nothing to do with it, because they're kind of seen as surrogates for these domineering powers. But that being said, and we know from a lot of research that local advocacy is incredibly important for the promotion of human rights domestically. And so that's really, that's a concern that I think we all need to be aware of if we're thinking about signing a petition or sending a letter or something, how is this like going to affect the local advocates in that state? But I think it sounds to me like your question, perhaps what you had in mind were those international NGOs.
Yes.
And so I think that they have a really important role to play. And in my view, that they can be most effective when trying to mobilize allied countries to take a stand. So let me give you an example. It was kind of example that didn't end up turning out very well, but the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. In the United States, there was a tremendous amount of outrage about that. Of course, there was a tremendous amount of outrage about that internationally. And a lot of international human rights organizations put pressure on the United States to sanction the Saudi regime. And I think that was effective to the extent that we did anything at all in the United States. So instead of your Amnesty International shaming the Saudi regime directly, you see, I think they're actually more effective in trying to mobilize those countries that have influence. Kind of going back to what Paul mentioned earlier, whether it's through economic leverage points or through military, strategic, or whatever, trying to kind of shame those countries in order to kind of put pressure on the violating regime.
But just sort of tangentially before we move on, I mean, by contrast, when the Amnesty International, organizations like Amnesty International call out the United States themselves for their record on human rights, that doesn't make the front pages, does it?
Well, it's funny that you bring that up, because something that I learned, which I didn't know before embarking on this research, is that the United States is actually like the most shamed country by Amnesty International. So if you count like their urgent actions and their reports and kind of all their material, the United States is target number one. And you might think, okay, what effect does that have? The United States is a very peculiar country in many ways. We, tend to think that no one can tell us what to do, and we kind of have this American exceptionalism. But it's, that being said, the United States is not necessarily it's not like we have no weak points, or that other countries have no influence. Or that we don't need other nations, or we don't need necessarily legitimacy. But of course, Amnesty International is also doing these other things in addition to targeting the United States and trying to get us to shame our behavior. It's trying to establish norms and a consensus, and providing information that could then be used by domestic groups to pressure our own government.
Right, that's very insightful. I think most of our viewers didn't know about the US's record, in Amnesty International's books as far as human rights is concerned.
It's almost all about the death penalty, because Amnesty historically focused a lot on the death penalty, and the United States is one of the few countries that still maintain the death penalty.
Yes, exactly. Paul, if I may, let's go back to some of the other countries around Southeast Asia and South Asia, and I know that you've made an in-depth study not just of the Indian geopolitical scenario, but across its periphery, all the way from Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and other economies beyond. We talked in some detail about India's position in this entire current sort of churn or scenario. How do some of these other Southeast Asian players feature in that equation?
So I think it's kind of country by country. I think I will say we're affected by things like global increases in the price of food, and other materials. So for instance, Sri Lanka, which already had a fairly disastrous economic situation, is now being even more afflicted, right? As kind of the shock waves emanate. And so I think we should expect to see further pressures on food prices and other kind of price, inflation pressures across much of the developed world, including around South Asia. So that's kind of background generally. Now, in terms of the current situation, I think that the biggest rivalry is less about kind of Europe versus Russia and much more about kind of India, China, America, sometimes Japan gets in the mix, geopolitical, whatever, competition, cooperation, maneuvering, let's call it that. And so there, it really depends on the country. It's been very interesting in the last few months, or more like the last year or so in Nepal, the ways in which questions around relations with the US and China have now become part of party politics in Nepal. So there was a big kind of political battle over ratifying this thing called the Millennium Corporation Challenge that had been quite uncontroversial previously, or not totally uncontroversial, but had not reached the level of kind of party mobilization and street protest that we saw earlier this year in Nepal. So we're seeing kind of US-China dynamics now in becoming part of Nepal's politics in, I think, a somewhat new way, but also not in a very straightforward way, kind of mixed up in this incredibly tumultuous internal political scene with different politicians and parties fractures and coalitions, and sometimes it's mobilized, sometimes it's not. And in some ways, this reminds me a little bit of the India issue in Nepal's politics, which would kind of Nepali nationalism would be mobilized in response to India, right? But somewhat unevenly over time by different actors in different times and places. And so it wouldn't surprise me to see US-China dynamics take on a similar kind of place in Nepal's politics, where sometimes it's talked about, how could you sell out to the Americans, or you're letting, the Chinese influence everything and buy us off. And in other elections, nobody talks about it at all. And it's about something completely different, right? It's like the CIA in India during the Cold War. Like sometimes it's, front and center issue that Mrs. Gandhi is mobilizing. Other times it's totally irrelevant. So Nepal, I think, is this very fluid, interesting dynamic. Sri Lanka, everything now has been swamped by the economic and political crisis. But still, and especially in the last 15 years, Sri Lanka had been a site of at least some kind of competition or maneuvering for influence between India and China, and to some extent the United States, Japan, Europe as well. And that's one in which we see some fairly straightforward questions around like who's getting what payoffs are being received by who, intersecting with deeper political issues like who supported the Sinhalese-dominated government most aggressively during its war against the Tamil Tigers. There, Pakistan, China, and to some extent India, were not leveraging the kind of criticism that the Americans and the Europeans were around human rights. And so that's remembered, both by the Tamil minority and the Sinhalese majority. And you can see different approval levels in survey data across different ethnic groups in Sri Lanka. So I would expect some of that to continue, though right now everything is being swamped by the crisis. I think we're seeing the Indians have really stepped in an important way to try to help stabilize the situation. The Chinese are floating around, the Americans are showing up. And so I think Sri Lanka and Nepal are the most clear examples of kind of competition in very fluid domestic political environments. Less complicated, I would say, is Pakistan, which has really tilted toward China, but is trying to keep an open door to the Americans. And Bangladesh, which under Sheikh Hasina has done quite a good job thus far of kind of being on good terms with lots of different big actors. I think the big question there is like, what is the future of Bangladesh's domestic politics? Right? What is the future of Awami League rule? What happens if it all falls apart or there's an unexpected disruption? And there are these very powerful but kind of repressed or submerged internal dynamics that could generate very high levels of instability. So for now, Bangladesh has done a very nice job kind of being on decent terms with everybody, but it's unclear what the future holds. And then Myanmar. Incredibly tragic situation since the coup of February 2021, escalating civil war. The Chinese have come to be associated with supporting the junta, in opposition to criticism from the Europeans, the Americans. India has tread very carefully, I think it's fair to say, because there are these, we can get into the insurgent dynamics in the Northeast and all the, do you want to, anyways, but there in a strange way, the conflict remains somewhat insulated from these broader geopolitical dynamics. It's basically a brutal knife fight between the military, an extremely bloody military, and then this growing coalition of aspirational revolutionaries attempting to overthrow it. And so there's Russian support traditionally for the junta, especially arms sales. The Chinese are supportive, but it hasn't really developed into a kind of a proxy war, against China or Russia, backed by the Indians or the Americans, at least at this point. So that gives kind of a 30,000 meters up sense of where we are in those different countries.
Thanks for that, Paul. Rochelle, I'm just mindful of the time, and we've got a bunch of questions from the audience, which we would want to open up to. But before that, I wanted to ask you, you talked some time ago around some of the new research methodologies and also new terminologies that have been coined in international relations. And I was wondering, while much of what happens in IR research and publications catches the mainstream media, are there important aspects of international relations research which you feel haven't maybe received their due?
Well, I think some, I probably would have said some things a couple of years ago that may not be true now, like climate change. And I think that we're finally starting to see in international relations some focused, rigorous, concentrated work on the effects of climate change in international relations and the dynamics in there. It's not as if folks weren't interested, but I think most people can agree that the work was insufficient compared to the severity of the threat. Now, this is just something that's on my mind. Of course, your list, your audience list might be different, but so just something that has been on my mind lately is actually something that one of the audience members brought up with these kind of big tech, Pegasus and other kinds of companies that are collecting massive amounts of data on people around the world. And that is part, I think, of a general trend of the role of big tech companies that are starting to serve state-like functions around the world. So if we think about the role of the state, the monopoly on violence, security, providing public goods, utilities, development, all the things that we think states do, we're starting to see those functions being filled by non-state actors, and particularly kind of these big multinational corporations and technology companies in particular. And so that, I think, leads to a lot of interesting questions. Interesting questions about the role of sovereignty and what sovereignty looks like now. It starts to bring up questions in international political economy in terms of the value of data and what that emerging market for data is going to look like. And I think, of course, then it brings up all sorts of perhaps troubling questions about human rights, individual freedoms, and surveillance. I tend to be, I think, a little mixed on this. On the one hand, I think that it's absolutely terrifying, kind of how much information these companies are collecting about us, and it's only going to get worse. And on the other hand, I think that some of these companies exaggerate how well they can predict us. And that in some ways gives me a small amount, like a glimmer of hope, in the sense that the human being is ultimately kind of unpredictable. So there have been, for example, leaks that show that Facebook lie about how well their ad prediction algorithms do. And, Blackwater and all these kind of companies kind of lie or exaggerate how well they're doing. So that, is perhaps hopeful. But on the other hand, I think we need to think a lot harder about the role of these firms and how they unsettle our basic kind of concepts and assumptions in world politics.
Great. Paul, do you want to come in for a quick comment before we go forward?
No, I mean, I would add on the climate piece. I think we all know it's going to be massive, but we really don't have a great sense of how this is going to shake out around the world. And so it's like we all know it's a problem, but then what? What will this actually look like?
Right, exactly. Great. So we've got a bunch of questions from the audience, although we've actually started to answer a few of those. But before that, we would request Dipesh to be brought back on screen for his maybe views of the conversation so far and any questions that he has. Yeah, no,
it's been very enjoyable to listen to Paul and Rochelle. And I guess I have a couple of quick questions. I mean, one probably more for Rochelle, and the other one is for both of you, and perhaps Paul too. So, as I was listening to you about talking about the war and human rights crisis in places like Afghanistan, I was wondering about how conceptually one distinguishes human rights violation from war crimes, and whether it's kind of peace and war distinction. Like Afghanistan is not at war, but there are human rights violations, or in any country there are human rights violations going on all the time. So is that a peace and war distinction? And the second question I was thinking about was really what Paul mentioned, that India has had this position that Europe's problems are not everybody's problems. But it seems to me that in many ways Europe's problems are everybody's problems at the moment. And particularly, as you were saying, Paul, so one direct impact of the war in Ukraine is on food prices. Ukraine was a major supplier of wheat. India actually banned export of wheat as a result of the crisis in the wheat market. And I was thinking, in that sense, there's an immediate impact on inflationary pressures everywhere, both in the developed. And the second question is, again, the gas. And in some ways, Russian sort of the special deals they're making about making gas available to countries has kind of a double-edged implication for the climate crisis. I mean, while gas is seen as the transition fuel before we move on to renewables, but because of the strategic marketing of gas, we might actually be extending the life of the period of this transition to our own detriment. And I've just come back from Australia, where India was participating in Quad, the alliance, some kind of alliance in the Pacific against China, while also distinguishing themselves from West and other parts. But I was just looking at the contradictory investment that Australia was making, sort of into, let's say, military, boosting their military arsenal, while the country is being battered by climate change, floods and fires. Just as I mean, Sydney, a lot of cities underwater at the moment as we speak. So going forward, my final question to of you: do you think the relative peace that we have seen in many parts of the world, India included, over the last 70 years, where I've lived my life without seeing a major war. There have been skirmishes and things. Do you think we are moving into a situation of much greater uncertainty, and the conditions of peace that may have held for the last 70 years in many parts of the world may not hold going into the future? I mean, that's an invitation to, hold some host to the future, hostages to the future. Yeah.
I can jump in, Dipesh. Thank you. Those are really rich questions. On the difference between human rights and war crimes. So I think I'm trying to imagine what it would be like if we had a few international lawyers here, and a few international human rights lawyers, and me and some advocates, and we would all probably approach this question really, really differently. Because I think the international human rights lawyers would say, well, there are different regimes, and human rights tend to engage state responsibility, and war crimes tend to indicate or involve a liability of individual criminals' actions, and so you can prosecute individuals. And I'm not saying that is unimportant, but I, at least with political science, I think tend to approach it as through a much more political lens, and say, yes, there are these different historical regimes, and they involve different legal nuances and different mechanisms and organizations that govern those. And of course, they've also been historically very intertangled in their development, their kind of simultaneous parallel developments after World War II. But in my view, the struggle around definitions is a political struggle, and the contestation over what constitutes a war crime or what constitutes a human rights is fundamentally a political contest. And so over the years, we've seen the human rights regime expand. For instance, it used to be that no one could violate human rights except for states. And now, we're starting to see conventions and legal regimes come up where corporations can violate human rights, non-state actors can violate human rights, insurgents can violate human rights. It used to be that human rights violations could be tracked back to an actor that was the violator. And now, if we see that a human rights violation in, the human rights to development, for example, it could be very difficult to trace that back to a discrete actor that violates that right. So what the normative implications of this kind of expansion and involve, I'm not sure. But what I do know is that I think as it expands, what we're also seeing is the co-optation and the manipulation and the political use of these definitions. They were always co-opted and used politically, of course, but now I think that's coming front and center. So it's a bit of a dodge to your question, I know, but unfortunately, I think that's at least how I would see it.
So
Thank you.
I can take some rambling thoughts on the second question, which was broad, and I think the word rich was great. So first of all, on the climate dynamics, I think it's fascinating, right? Like price of oil, you should be seeing people now starting to kind of accelerate green transitions. On the other hand, if oil is a strategic resource that's being used to buy people off, offer at a discount, then it has the opposite effect. I have no idea how that shakes out, but I think it's one thing you could imagine is this uneven impact across countries, depending on their kind of relationship to oil and gas and renewables. So thinking about kind of unevenness rather than kind of global trends or convergence is one way to think about it. And then more broadly, kind of the future of warfare in general is tricky because there are a lot of reasons that countries don't go to war, even if they don't like each other, right? The last major war India and China had was in 1962, despite many skirmishes and a lot of unpleasantness, right? So a major war between India and China, for instance, is it looming in the background of nuclear weapons. You've got mountains, hugely costly conflicts, regimes, governments that are focused on a whole variety of other things that are in some ways more central to their political survival, whether it's economic growth, however defined, or service provision, or internal repression, or whatever. So I don't expect kind of a new world of constant warfare, but I do think it's worth kind of broadening the aperture in terms of what we think about as plausible outcomes, right? So this is a little bit of the political scientist dodge. Like probabilistically, it is now more likely that we see some really bad outcomes, both between countries, but also I think, as we think about food prices, kind of climate change, serious pressures internally within countries as well, right? So there's been civil wars, internal conflicts rose after the end of the Cold War. Then they started declining. It was like, oh, great. Last 10 years, it's now we're kind of getting back up to the period right after the end of the Cold War with Bosnia, Kosovo, Liberia, kind of that.
So what you're saying is there could be more civil wars rather than...
Or you could get both, right? It's not even a choice. You could get both kind of growing.
Well, I'm just thinking that given that the uncertainties seem to be increasing on so many fronts,
yep.
Food, climate, and these are major uncertainties. And so it must lead to a less stable world. And the question is, what is the specific form of that less stable?
I think at the international economic level, it's more blocks, at least partial blocks, where kind of certain countries will not trade certain materials now with China or technology. Right. Supply chains are getting reconfigured, so that's blocking. Interstate conflict, I don't expect lots of major power war, but certainly kind of a return to a higher level of arms racing, at least to some extent, with all kinds of domestic constraints. And then I do think it's plausible to expect growing internal instability. Now that could take the form of civil wars and insurgencies, popular uprisings, protests, all of these things that occur in conflict.
Bread riots and things like that.
Exactly. Politicized kind of politically salient scarcity, right?
Yeah.
All of that. It can manifest itself in a couple of different ways, but that's what I would expect to see. And one thing I'll just add is people on this call may disagree, and people in the comments, it's not clear what the right answer to many of these questions is, right? In the old days, there was kind of global neoliberalism in the 90s. Before that, there were a lot of true believers in communism and state socialism. the solution, right? I don't know who's especially confident in their ideological model right now. Even the Chinese, kind of, the regime exists in this perpetual state of insecurity.
And Paul, we haven't talked about migration. I mean, the asylum seekers. The official number is 67 million, and I read that the real number is like 100, or a little over 100 people just moving around looking for a place to go. Yeah.
So I think we have some bumpy years ahead.
Sure. Yeah.
If I could just offer my 2 cents following Paul. Do we have time?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Mine is much less concrete, but I just was reminded of something that I teach my students when we're talking about the international normative order, about how so many of the things that we take for granted could collapse and fall apart at any minute as kind of ideational phenomena. And that is, you can kind of see that as a bit depressing. But on the other hand, I think there kind of 2 implications come from that. One is that the things that I think that we thought were very stable all along were perhaps not as stable as we thought that they were, and were actually really fragile all along. And then the second implication is that we tend to have a status quo bias as human beings, that kind of whatever is happening right now, it was inevitable and that is going to continue. And so in the 90s, it was happy and stable and everyone thought that was going to continue. And now it's kind of chaotic and miserable, at least from where I sit. And we think that that's going to continue. And something that I would just want to remind myself is that we don't know, and that kind of status quo bias could be coming into effect, and that it doesn't necessarily have to be that this kind of chaos and misery is going to be forever.
Right. Dipesh, I know you mentioned you were talking earlier about the migrants, the refugee crisis, and one of the questions from the audience is exactly around that from Chanda, talking about the worldwide refugee crisis and whether or not that might trigger another set of conflicts, within economies as well as cross-border, and I think this is a bit extreme, full-fledged global war, but if not that, at least exacerbation of conflicts within countries and beyond.
So I think that seems pretty plausible. I mean, we've already seen this. So for instance, the turn in European politics from 2010 to 2020 has a lot to do with the refugee crises, both coming out of the Middle East and also from North Africa. So I think it's not just armed conflict that we're likely to see, but I think it's, I think it's been notable the shift around immigration in the US, in Western Europe. Also, I think, I don't know Australia particularly, but certainly it's an issue in Australia, Canada. So there are the places that are have become hubs of migration, right? And I think we've seen, it's fair to say, in general, a populist backlash, I think, with lots of caveats, et cetera. It's interesting where it hasn't been at all, right? Places like South Korea or Japan that are depopulating at staggeringly, alarmingly fast rates, and yet, there's very little desire for substantially greater immigration. There's a lot of unevenness here, but I think we're certainly, it creates kindling for populist backlashes in kind of the developed world. And then most refugees and migrants are not in the developed world. They are kind of in places, Afghan refugees in places like Iran and Pakistan, which are struggling enormously already under all kinds of political and economic pressures, right? So I think greater migration, I think often, unfortunately, puts greater political and economic stress on kind of recipient states, and that can generate backlashes politically, but also conflicts over scarce resources, land in particular, potentially armed conflict developing from that. I don't anticipate global war emerging from that, but certainly it's a further risk factor that adds to instability and exacerbates scarcity often.
I know we've just gone beyond the hour, but maybe we have time for another question or two. So let's bring up Shubha's question. Just give it a minute. Okay. So maybe I should just read out the question while we're waiting for it to come up on screen. So Shubha is saying, as the century keeps progressing, There we go. We keep seeing how various questions of ethnic or national identities keep being used by the big imperial powers for their own international maneuverings. Do you think that there's any chance of international solidarity building up that might be able to question or challenge this?
Rochelle, do you want to take a first cut at this, or would you like me to? It's a great question.
It is. I'm just marinating in it. And, you know, I think I'm imagining my colleague, John Mearsheimer, again, what he would say to this question, which is probably something like national identity is so intrinsic and powerful that it will always, or most of the time, trump these kind of other transnational identities. And that it is just such a powerful force that is kind of difficult to transcend. On the other hand, I'm thinking about the rise in Islamism in the 90s and 2000s, for example, or after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which I think very self-consciously tried to transcend national identities and establish a kind of different kind of tie that transcended kind of these post-colonial borders. So it certainly it fits in some, as the question implicates, it fits in some people's interest to keep those ethnic or national identities fired up. Mm-hmm. But you know, as we have seen, that the victims of interethnic conflict are often the masses, you know, the ones that are not actually doing this kind of manipulation. So that, of course, is a complete, you know, dodge to your question. But I would not be surprised, actually, despite all of the populist backlash that we've seen and the nationalist rhetoric in the last few years. I think, as Paul mentioned, that there's no one can be confident in their ideology right now, and so I could see those kind of nationalist that nationalism resurging, but I could also see something else, something new that kind of builds a kind of international solidarity across borders.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump off that, I think we want to be careful about not having too much of a top-down view of these things, right? So I've spent a good amount of time studying places like Sri Lanka and Myanmar, where local actors are, you know, they're not necessarily being manipulated or preyed upon by outsiders. They believe these things, and they mobilize over long periods of time, you know, in quite costly ways to advocate for them, right? You look at the rise of the Sinhalese Buddhist nationalist movement in Sri Lanka, it goes back decades prior to independence. So I think that makes the problem more complicated, right? It's not just simply a matter of kind of imperial powers drawing new lines and people kind of, you know, for whatever reason responding to them, but these are often quite deeply rooted and have kind of local political entrepreneurs and actors who are invested in them. That said, right, I think Rochelle's right that we've seen tides of transnationalism before. Global Islam, neoliberalism, communism, right? All of these have had enormous consequences for the way the world is at its most fundamental level is structured, right? Think about, you know, the rise of the global left, the hard left after 1917 reshaped large parts of the world in very fundamental ways. So the fact that national and ethnic identities really matter does not mean that other identities either don't matter or don't intersect and interact with those in very complicated ways. I'm reading, it's not here right now, but this great new history of the first Vietnam War between 1946 and 1954. And one of the recurring themes is that the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh side kind of fused together nationalism and communism in both very sincere and genuine ways simultaneously. They were neither one nor the other, right? And that really shaped the nature of their project, their organizational processes. And so it wasn't a triumph of nationalism, nor was it a triumph of communism. It was kind of and both, right, in complex ways. So I don't think we want to also say that kind of ethnicity / nationalism is the same thing across space, or that it's unaffected by some of these transnational tides. Let me, however, add a little wrinkle here, which is some of the transnational actors I think we maybe see solidarity across are not necessarily kind of the masses, but are different kinds of local actors who have shared global interests, or transnational actors like multinational corporations, right? And so one argument you see from people who don't think that Asia is fated to be a domain of great power competition is not about solidarity from below, but about kind of, the business of East Asia is business, as David Kang at USC, at University of Southern California says, where you see kind of powerful transnational actors with very strong interests in not having costly conflict, trying to kind of cobble together, kind of capitalist or state capitalist peace in a way that is kind of solidaristic in the sense of not wanting interstate conflict, but doesn't look like solidarity in the ways that I think that word is normally used. So we could see all kinds of transnational organization, whether from below or above, both by elites and non-elite actors in ways that could be really interesting. And we've certainly seen that many times in the past. So I think we should only expect something like that in the future. We just don't know what it will be.
I think this has been such an engrossing conversation. We could keep going for another hour, but being mindful of the time, I really want to thank Paul, Rochelle, both of you for this absolutely fascinating conversation. And Dipesh, maybe some final concluding thoughts before we wrap up today's session.
Well, I just want to, as you go back to where you began, Avik, talk about the journey of these two series of Chicago dialogues, and I'm very grateful to you, to Aniket and his team, Akash and Ronak and others, and the Chicago University team, first led by Aditi Modi, then led by Lenny Chaudhary, for all that they have done to make this successful. And I personally have learned a tremendous amount of, not only about the world, but also about what my colleagues do and what they think about. And actually, it's quite amazing to see the overlaps in concerns. I come from a different disciplines, history or South Asian studies, but there are connections. And then I want to say, one reason we could do this series is because of the way that University of Chicago promotes interdisciplinary conversations all the time. And so as we conclude this series, the second series, let me again thank you, everybody. Wish you well. And good night and good day, depending on where you are. Okay, and thank you, Avik, once more for really being a wonderful anchor. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.